without any further introduction, here we go.
Well, hello you all, and I'm very, very happy to be here, and especially want to thank Luke Devlin for carefully sort of finding me, hunting me up, and luring me out here, and very much to thank Alistair and Orion for being such wonderful hosts, Alistair McIntosh. And here I am in this freezing land so far away from northern New Mexico, where I just flew over here from. I want to just start the evening with a small story, and I won't set the context at all. I think I'll just launch into it. I'm hiking back down from the upper yak pastures where I've been spending the morning and the afternoon. I'm hiking back down to the small Sherpa village where I've been living with an elderly zonkri, or medicine person. And on my way back down, I recognized this boulder that the zonkri had pointed out to me as a place that he went to dance before attempting any particularly difficult cures. And so when I recognized that boulder, I walked over to it and stepped out on it. It's this big rock jutting out over the steep, very far below the river gorge. Way down there, the hiss of the river, and its ribbon is reflecting blue of the sky overhead. And this rock is sticking out over the canyon. And I stepped out on it, not to dance, as the magician had told me he did there, but just to ponder the pale red and crinkly black lichens spreading on its surface. And to gaze out across the canyon. I settled down on this rock, cross-legged, but I won't do that here because then you won't see me. And I'm gazing underneath this ringing blue sky, clear as a bell, Himalayan sky, and way across the gorge is the next wave of the Himalaya. Ice peaks, all sorts of furrows with ice and snow laden in their furrows, and deltas of dark, tumbled rock beneath them. And just to my side of those peaks are two huge birds, lammergeiers, one of the largest birds on the planet. The lammergeiers can stretch their wingspan over 10 feet, but they didn't look very big at the moment, just way off there. Two of them soaring toward the north. I sat down on this rock and began this aimless sleight-of-hand exercise. Took a coin out of my pocket and began rolling it over my knuckles. This was something I took up there in Nepal in response to the endless flicking of prayer beads by the old Sherpa elders, all of which who often have these rosaries of prayer beads, and they're running them through their fists continuously. And with each bead comes the prayer, Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, which loosely translated would mean, may all sentient beings fall in love with one another. The literal translation is, well, the exoteric literal translation would be, the jewel in the lotus. The jewel in the lotus. The jewel in the lotus. The esoteric translation is more, the penis in the vagina. The penis in the vagina. But this is the cosmic penis in the cosmic vagina that is conceiving and giving birth to the 10,000 things, to the multiple forms of the world, continuously surging up out of the emptiness at each moment. Ah, the jewels in the lotus. But there's no prayer accompanying my coin as it's rolling over my fingers. Just that ringing blue sky and those icy peaks out there and those two birds soaring. And as I'm gazing out, I notice that one of those two lammergeiers is beginning to soar out away from its partner in a wide arc over the gorge, turning and turning in this arc until it seems to be headed kind of toward the rock where I'm sitting. So I stopped rolling the coin and just stared at it. But just at that moment, the bird swerved in its trajectory and began heading back toward its partner in the distance. Shucks. So I took up the coin again and began rolling it over my knuckles, letting its shiny surface, I now realize, reflect the late afternoon sun's rays back up into the sky. Because as soon as I started rolling this coin again, that bird swung out from its path and began soaring in that wide arc over the gorge, turning and curving more until once again it seemed to be heading kind of toward the rock where I'm sitting. No, not kind of toward the rock, it's coming straight toward this rock. And it keeps coming. And you know how when something is coming straight toward you out of the distance, you don't really see anything move. You just kind of see it grow and get larger and larger and larger still. And as the great size of this bird becomes apparent, I'm starting to feel my skin beginning to crawl and come alive like a community of bumblebees all in motion. And a humming is getting louder and louder in my ears as this being gets larger and larger and larger still until it's there, hovering, stopped in the air, just above my head, about 10 feet up, huge wing feathers rustling as they mastered the breeze. The coin fell out of my hand and dropped down the cliff. And then I felt myself stripped naked by this alien gaze, 10 times more lucid than my own. I don't know how long I was transfixed in this way, only that I felt the wind pouring past my naked knees and rushing through my feathers long after this visitor had departed. But I really had this sense of feathers as having sprouted from my upper thighs and from my upper arms, and the wind was tugging my shoulders back, and it was rushing in my ears loudly. And I'm coming to my senses and looking around, and nothing is moving on the ground around me, not a blade of grass, but this rush of wind in my ears. Where is this rushing sound coming from? And then I caught sight of the guest, now halfway back across the gorge, soaring back toward its partner in the distance. So, what I wanted to speak to you about tonight is some of the feelings or notions are those that came to me originally when I was traveling as an itinerant sleight-of-hand magician through Southeast Asia, almost half a lifetime ago, 20 years back, traveling, interested in meeting the traditional magicians who practice their craft in the rural backwaters of Indonesia, of Sri Lanka, of Nepal. Actually, this work started, the very idea of this came to me when, after a couple of years of college, I dropped out for a year and just started traveling as an itinerant magician through Europe and ended up in England working with your fellow Glaswegian R.D. Lang, a great, mad psychiatrist, anti-psychiatrist, in his community in London called the Philadelphia Association. And I fell in with this crew entirely by accident. I met Lang when I was performing actually in some restaurant, and got drawn into this community and into the practice of using sleight of hand as a way of communicating with folks who were in various extreme states of psychological distress, and who were very resistant to any conversation, but approaching them not with any words, but just using my hands and a coin or a stone, a rock, making it vanish, making it reappear. These people began to get very interested and drawn into relation. And I became very interested in the uses of magic in medicine, in curing and in healing. And so a couple of years later, I embarked on this journey through Southeast Asia to meet the traditional magicians and medicine people who ply their craft in these village regions. But I was traveling not outwardly as an anthropologist or an academic of any sort, or a researcher. I was traveling as a magician in my own right, a sleight-of-hand magician, in hopes of using this craft, or maybe in the thought that my craft as a magician would pique the interest of these more traditional magic practitioners. And in fact, this was very successful. And I got in way over my head and was drawn into the company of a number of these exceedingly bizarre individuals called dukuns in Indonesia, called zangkris in Nepal. And I was invited into their homes, asked to trade secrets with them, and ultimately to participate in various of their ceremonies. And like I say, I got in way over my head. But what I wanted to speak of here a bit tonight is the fact that my original interest in medicine, in folk medicine, began to shift in the course of living with some of these folks. It began to alter and become a much more intense fascination with the relation between these traditional magicians and the wider natural landscape. Because none of these folks ever lived in the middle of their communities. They never seemed to make their home in the middle of the village. They were always out at the edge of the community, or even just beyond the village edge, just inside the forest. Or in Nepal, amid a cluster of wild boulders that was off on its lonesome, a ways away from the village, but places where the villagers themselves would not venture at night because they were too sakti, too powerful. These regions or realms out at the boundary where the magicians made their home. Because you see, the magician's intelligence in such traditional cultures, the particular kind of savvy common to such magicians, is not encompassed within the usual boundaries of the human community. Its place is really at the edge, mediating between the human world, the human community of conversation discourse and interaction, mediating between that world and the whole more than human community within which the human world is embedded. And by the more than human community, I don't mean anything supernatural. I mean simply the community that includes us two-leggeds, but includes as well all of the other walking and crawling and leaping critters that live in that locale, as well as the other flapping and soaring folks who squawk and sing at dawn and at dusk and glare down at us. Ha, ha. But also the Finn peoples who live in the streams and the lakes, or in the ocean surrounding the Indonesian islands. All of these creatures are soon to be not just alive, but awake, aware intelligences to the mind of these traditional communities. But not just the other animals, also the plants, the rooted powers, the trees, herbs, even whole forests were assumed to have their own personality, their own sentience. Not just the other animals and plants, though. Even the winds and the weather patterns. Rivers, dry riverbeds, these too. Mountains, boulders, clouds, everything, in fact, everything that we can see or sense is assumed to be a sensitive and even sentient power in its own right. This is a style of experience that, as I'm sure many of you know, it was given the name animism by the early ethnologists and anthropologists at the end of the 19th century. Animism, by which they meant to say, these are cultures that don't make a clear divide between that which is animate on the one hand and that which is inanimate on the other. Rather, for these folks, it seems that everything is animate. Everything moves. It's just that some things move a lot slower than other things. Like the walls of this building, like the ground itself. And yet, it still moves. The building itself still breathes. Everything is animate. And the magicians, it turns out, what we sometimes these days call the shamans, borrowing a term that comes from northern Siberia. The traditional magicians are those folks who are more susceptible than others to the calls, the cries, the gestures, the solicitations of these other than human styles of experience. That is to say, the magicians are simply the sensitives. They are those folk who are a little more porous than most of the people in their communities. Porous, by which I mean they feel things a little more easily. Other people percolate through them. I'm sure there are several people like this in the room. Folks who, well, for instance, something from my own childhood or youth growing up, the fact that I found myself, without knowing I was doing it, it's only later I realized how much I take on the accent of whoever I'm speaking to. I can't help it. But if I'm talking to somebody, I immediately start taking on something of their accent. That is, my body is mimetic. Other people percolate right through me. And I didn't know this until I got to college, and my college housemates would laugh at me when I was on the phone, because if I'm talking to, one of our, well, they would know the nationality of the person I'm talking to, because I'd start gesticulating like this, and they know I'm talking to one of the Italian people that are at the college. Or if I'm talking in the back of my throat, they know I'm talking to one of our Russian classmates. If I'm speaking up here, they know I'm talking to a French person. And they pointed this out to me, and I began to feel horrified. How can this be that I so readily take on the characteristics of those who I'm in relation with? But folks who are porous like this are so sensitive, or in our culture we call them oversensitive. That is to say, you feel things too intensely, and it's not really good for anything. Folks like this, you could be sitting in a room, at a party, in a conversation, and somebody else comes in the room all bummed out because they've just gotten fired from their job or something, and they're really down. And you're not even looking at them, but you kind of start feeling really bummed out and down without quite knowing why. Or somebody else comes in all elated, something great just happened, and you start feeling kind of really good without necessarily even looking at that person. You feel it. Again, other people percolate through your organism. And this kind of sensitivity is not really functional in our society. But in a healthy society, in a culture that knows that everything is alive, this kind of sensitivity or oversensitivity is actually quite useful. Because to have a nervous system that is so sensitive may be way too much for just hanging out with other nervous systems that are shaped just like your own, other humans. But it may be just right for entering into a rapport with a frog, or with an oak tree, or with a slab of granite, for that matter. And folks who are like this in traditional, oral, indigenous communities, as they become aware of themselves, first as children, already by the time they're in their teens, they're gravitating toward the edge of the community, where they begin to make or stake their claim at that edge, where with one hand they can be in relation to the humans and the human goings on, but with the other hand, they're in relation to the forest and to all of the other shapes of sensitivity and sentience that compose the forest and inhabit that forest. And this becomes their role, their accepted function for their communities, is tending the boundary between the human world and the more than human community of powers, spirits, intelligences that inhabit and constitute the local landscape. There's a little haiku-like poem by my American colleague, Gary Snyder, that gets at this animistic sensibility very, very swiftly and simply. He says, "As the cricket's soft autumn hum is to us, so are we to the trees, as are they to the rocks and the hills. As the cricket's soft autumn humming is to us, so are we to the trees, as are they to the rocks and the hills." You all follow that? Each being listening to all the others, and each speaking or living, but each at its own rate, with its own pulse. Everything has its pulse, its interior animation, its rhythm, its dance in the world. And the more time I spent living with traditional magicians, the more I found my senses starting to come awake. Much more attentive and aware to all sorts of nuances in the surrounding terrain. Subtleties, the way the breeze that gusts down from the upper passes feels just at this time of day as it's flooding through this field. And no other time of day, but just before dusk. Particular scents in the air, and beginning to notice these differences. The way a single leaf on a tree may flutter, leaving all the other leaves unmoved, but that one leaf fluttering, some breeze just flowing through there. Noticing these distinctions and subtleties, and other animals are starting to accompany me in my wandering. Instead of flapping away as I walk past, lizards skittering close or leaning forward as I move through the village. Something was shifting in my own way of being as I began to enter into conversations with these curious humans who assumed that everything is aware. It seemed to me that this style of experience is our most basic, ordinary human way of feeling the earth around us, feeling the world around us. That this is plain and ordinary, something all of us knew when we were born in our first years before it got beat out of us by education or by professions. And so I'm leaping here. When I came back to North America, I became a student of perception and very intensely studying the psychology of sensory experience, the phenomenology of perception, the philosophy of sensory encounter with the world. And the more I study the neurophysiology of vision, of touch and the skin, of how our senses work and feel, the more I became convinced that this is our most ordinary, normal human way of feeling the world. I mean, consider the obvious but easily overlooked fact that the hand with which we explore the tactile textures of the world, the hand is itself a touchable, tactile thing. It has its own texture, right? Its own rough or smooth surface. So when I reach out and touch the bark of a tree, or the smooth bark of an aspen near my home, I'm not just touching that tree, I'm also feeling myself touched by the tree. I'm feeling myself, yes, explored, my surfaces touched by this other being. I mean, there's this curious reversibility to the sense of touch. The wind as it blows past my face, I'm not just feeling the wind against me, I'm also feeling the wind feeling me, sampling my texture or the chemical emanations from my skin. This curious reversibility to the sense of touch extends to all the senses, though. Gazing out at the world, we open our eyes in the morning and sort of brush the sleep out of them and open our door and gaze out across the street or across the little valley to the forested hillside opposite where my little cabin is. But gazing that hillside, I'm not just seeing those trees and that hillside there, I'm also feeling myself exposed to that hillside. Because the eyes with which I look out at the visible world, they themselves are visible. They have their own shiny surface, like the surface of a pond. My eyes have their glistening smoothness, their color, in my case a kind of greenish brown, like the color of a leaf, or of the sky, or of, yes, a pond. So when I gaze out at that hillside, I'm not just seeing it there, I'm also feeling myself seen from there. I'm feeling myself exposed to those trees. I'm feeling myself noticed. Feeling myself as visible to the other beings around. And that this is our most ordinary, normal, human way of feeling the world is attested by the discourse of virtually every indigenous oral culture we know of. Like the Koyukon people of central Alaska, who say that they live in a forest of eyes, that all of these beings are always looking at them. Therefore, they must take great care how they move, must take great care how they live, even when other humans aren't around, because so many beings are attending to them. Or where I live now, in the desert southwest of North America, the Navajo people, or the Diné, as they call themselves, who say things like, I must be humble in the face of these mountains. I must be humble in the face of these rocks. I must be humble in the face of the ground itself. All of these beings are watching me. Therefore, I must take care how I move. I must take care how I walk. Because I would claim this animistic style of perception is ordinary. It is utterly basic. It's baseline for the human critic. But then the question would arise, how could we ever have lost it? How could we ever have broken out of such a kind of reciprocal relation with every part of an animate landscape into the fairly inanimate, mechanical, determinate cosmos that most of us and our colleagues and our fellow citizens seem to inhabit today, where the moon and the sun no longer draw prayers from us as they move through the sky. And the ground itself is not a being that feels your steps as you walk on it. So we don't have to pay much attention to how we walk, and we don't. How could this have come about? And I'll just hazard a bit of an answer. And and in hopes of seeding and opening a conversation. All of the deeply indigenous cultures of place that we tend to extol, or that us ecologists tend to praise as living in some kind of reciprocal relation with their local landscapes, in a relatively harmonious relation with the particular terrains that they inhabit. All of these tend to be oral cultures, traditionally oral cultures. Cultures that have traditionally flourished in the absence of a formal writing system, whether we're speaking of the Koyukon in Alaska, or the Navajo, or the Hopi, or the Lakota of the plains, or the Kayapo and the Guarani of the Amazon basin, or the Sami of northern Scandinavia, or the Pijanta Jara and the Pintubi peoples of Australia, or the Ogoni of Nigeria. All of these cultures, so exquisitely tuned to their particular places, are cultures that have developed and flourished without a highly formalized system of writing. They are oral cultures, deeply oral cultures. And so we might wonder, what is it that writing does to our senses and to our sensory experience of the earth around us? It's a big question. I think what I want to do now, just by way of seeding the conversation, is read just a couple pages from this recent book I wrote, because I think there are some common elements to cultures without writing. And I want to mention a few of these. See if this makes sense to you, if any of this is familiar. Because, I mean, indigenous oral cultures are weirdly different from one another, but it's possible to discern a few commonalities. And these kind of generalizations are always dangerous, and they're prone to be, misheard, misinterpreted. But as long as we acknowledge that any such culture will exhibit this in its own way and in its own terrain, it's going to be expressed very uniquely, then maybe we might dare to mention some of these commonalities. One, oral culture is intensely local in its orientation. Without the many communication technologies recently spawned by the printed word, indigenous oral awareness is way more deeply informed by the immediate locale than most modern folks can even imagine. In the absence of intervening technologies, our senses co-evolved for millions of years with the textures, colors, and sounds of surrounding nature, spontaneously couple themselves to shapes and dynamic patterns in the living landscape, tracking those patterns as they metamorphose through the seasons. The leafing time of the local trees, the rhythms of bud and blossom and fruit, the reticence of various animals in certain months and their antic exuberance in others, all of these unfoldings in the immediate environment provide a set of sensuous metaphors for the complex pulse of our own emotions and a basic template for our cogitations. The human animal is a creature of imagination, sure, but our imagination is first provoked and infused by the earthly place where we dwell, or by the wider terrain wherein we circulate. Indigenous oral intelligence is place-based intelligence, an awareness infused by the local terrain. Two, the simple act of perception is experienced as an interchange between oneself and that which one perceives, as a meeting, a participation, a communion between beings, because each thing that we sense is assumed to be sensitive in its own right, able to feel and respond to the beings around it and to us. Three, each perceived presence is felt to have its own dynamism, its own pulse, its own active agency in the world. Each phenomenon has its ability to affect and influence the space around it and the other beings in its vicinity. So the surrounding world is experienced less as a collection of objects than as a community of active agents or subjects. And so every human community would seem to be nested within a much larger, more than human community of beings. Fourth, the ability of each thing or entity to influence the space around it might be viewed as the expressive power of that being. So all things in this sense are potentially expressive. All things speak. Most, of course, don't speak in words, but this is true also of us. Our own verbal eloquence is just one form of human expression among many others, because our body, in its silence, is already expressive. The body itself speaks. Fifth, since our own sensitive and sensuous bodies are entirely a part of the world we perceive, since we are carnally embedded within the sensuous field, then we can experience things only from our own limited angle and place among them. Hence, we have only a partial view of each entity or situation that we encounter. There is no aspect of the world that can be fathomed or figured out by us in its entirety. There are always aspects that are hidden from view, dimensions that we can't perceive directly. The depth of the world, and indeed of any part of the world, is therefore inexhaustible. Every certainty, every instance of clear knowledge is necessarily surrounded by a horizon of uncertainty shading into mystery. Sixth, to an oral culture, the world is articulated as story. The surrounding cosmos is not experienced as a set of fixed and finished facts, but as a story in which we, along with the moon sliding in and out of the clouds, and the trout leaping for a fly, are all participants in this story. Because the relation of a tale to its character is much the same as the relation of this earthly cosmos to its inhabitants, just as there's an interiority to the perceived world around us, carnally enfolded as we are by the sky and the round expanse of the horizon. So the characters in a well-told story live and breathe within the voluminous interiority of the tale itself. In other words, we find ourselves situated in the land with its changes and its cycles of transformation, much as protagonists are situated in a story. To any deeply oral culture, the earthly world is felt as a huge, ever-unfolding story in which we, along with the other animals, plants, and landforms, are all characters. Seventh, there are 9 of them. No, 8. Seventh, in such a breathing cosmos, time is not a rectilinear movement from a distant past to a wholly different future. Rather, time has an enveloping roundness, like the encircling horizon. It's a mystery marked by the slide of the sun down into the ground every evening, and its rebirth every dawn, by the incessant cycling of the moon and the round dance of the seasons. So the curvature of time is here inseparable from the apparent curvature of space, and indeed both of these remain rooted in the round primacy of place, because each place has its particular pulse. Each realm has its rhythm, its unique ways of sprouting and unfurling and giving birth to itself again and again and again. As the world itself turns and returns, and as indeed the best stories are told over and again. Eighth, a world made of story is an earth permeated by dream, a terrain filled with imagination. But this isn't so much our imagination as it is the world's imagination, in which our own actions are participants. As players within an expansive, ever-unfolding story, our lives are embedded within a psyche that is not primarily ours. The dreamy, emotional atmosphere that permeates a story is much like the fluid air, the atmosphere that enfolds our breathing body. With its storms and its calms, awareness itself is here inseparable from the air, from this invisible medium infused with sunlight, which circulates both within and around us, binding our life together with that of the tempest and the swaying pine trees. So mind is not experienced here as an exclusively human property, much less as a private possession that resides within your head. While there might be an interior quality to the mind, yeah, to a deeply oral culture, this interiority derives not from a belief that the mind is located inside us, but from a felt awareness that we are bodily situated inside it, that we are carnally immersed in a mind that is not ours, but is rather the earth's. And finally, 9th, each entity participates in this enveloping awareness from its own angle and orientation according to the proclivities of its own flesh. We inhale the awakened atmosphere through our skin or our flaring nostrils or the stomata in our leaves, circulating it within ourselves, lending something of our unique chemistry to the collective medium as we exhale. Each of us thus animated by the wider intelligence, even as we tweak and transform that intelligence. The rooted powers, the trees, the plants among us twist and flex in the invisible surge of wind. Other creatures are carried aloft by the whirling currents. The denser life of rock may seem impervious to those winds, but the creviced contours of the mountains have been carved over eons by the creativity of wind and weather, as those mountains now carve the wind in turn, coaxing spores out of the breeze and conjuring clouds out of the fathomless blue. So the wild mind of this planet blows through all of us, ensconced as we are in the depths of this elusive medium of air. But although it's our common element, every one of us experiences it differently. No two bodies or beings ever inhabit this big awareness from precisely the same angle or with the same sensory organization and style, since the body is precisely our interface and exchange with the field of awareness. Well, then, a praying mantis's experience of mind is as weirdly different from mine as its spindly body is different from mine. And the dreaming of an aspen grove is as different from both mine and the mantis's as its own fleshly interchange with the medium is different from ours. It is our bodies that participate in awareness, in the psyche. And hence no one can feel, much less know, precisely how this big mystery reveals itself to anyone else. Finally, here's another way this might be said. Each of us, by our actions, is composing our part of the story in concert with the other bodies or beings around us. But since we are situated within the story, dreaming our way through its voluminous depths according to the unique ways of our flesh, no one of us can discern precisely how this story can best be told or articulated by anyone else. No human individual can fathom just how the encompassing imagination is experienced by any other person, much less by a turtle or a thundercloud or by a car door patiently rusting at the junkyard, its viridian paint flaking off in the desert heat. Our carnal immersion in the depths of the mysterious thus ensures an inherent and inescapable pluralism. And yet, although there's no single way to tell it, it's the same tale that is unfurling itself through our gazillion and one gestures. It remains the same earth whose life-giving breath we all inhabit, the very same mystery that we each experience from our own place within its depths. Okay, so those are a few of the qualities that I think are common to oral cultures the world over. And I want to open this up. And I don't know if these folks over here. So I'm curious if anything I've said makes some sense, if it resonates, or if it seems completely off kilter. But what I'm on about these days is a sense that there is no way to replenish this kind of intimacy with the land and with other creatures and the elemental earth. And there's no way to rejuvenate the kind of face-to-face community and rich interpersonal intimacy that is common to oral cultures without rejuvenating that layer of language that goes hand in hand with such intimacy. And that's oral culture, beginning to tell stories again. Beginning, to tell stories, even certain stories that we don't write down at all. Stories that we find or that come upon us in a particular place, and I realize, wait a minute, I'm not going to write down this tale so that it can be taken somewhere else and read in distant cities. This tale belongs to this place, and I'm going to tell it in this place and gather some other people for the telling. Beginning to restore the earth around, not just restoring it, because I don't think we can restore the land without restoring the land. Rejuvenating oral culture, it seems to me, is an ecological imperative. Does this make sense? And what thoughts does it spark?
It was interesting when you began. I was listening without even thinking about it. As soon as you started reading from the book, I thought maybe I should be making notes. I need to remember 9 points. And then my mind drifted off.
Okay. So I gave a simple demonstration here of the profound difference between oral and literary styles. I hear it. Forgive me for reading. I just recently published this book, and some of it is still so fresh in me, and I'm trying to take in and learn in my own muscles some of the phrases that found their way onto the page. But writing is so bizarrely different, and there are certain things that just don't translate onto the page. And there are many experiences that I wanted to put in this work, in this book, that when I got to that point, I realized, actually, I cannot write this down. It doesn't belong between the pages of a book. It has to live on the tongue, and between the tongue and the ear. Other thoughts? Yeah.
If I can cross those out, or reflecting on the repetition, some opinions, not exactly the program of this tonight. How do you think it's possible that
Well, it's definitely not about throwing out all our books now. And now there's even this weirder kind of literacy, the digital literacy, the internet, which is even more disembodied and placeless than the book and the written word. It seems to be almost inherently globalizing. But that's not going away anytime soon. I do think it is about replenishing oral culture, but not to the exclusion of literacy or books, nor to the exclusion of the internet, but underneath those more abstract layers of culture, beginning to replenish this most basic layer of human conviviality and exchange as the secret soil in which those more disembodied or more abstract layers of the self, more abstract layers of human culture are secretly still rooted. I think without that oral layer, the literate mind begins to go batty. It begins to forget the body and the body's dependence upon a bodily world of animals, plants, and it begins to wreak havoc upon that world. Clear cutting, damming up the rivers. Is it possible to be literate and oral at the same time? Absolutely. give you one example. I'm Jewish, and in my Jewish tradition, in a sense, one could say that the Hebrews were the first keepers of the alphabet. This incredible Semitic innovation or invention that we call the alphabet, phonetic writing. It emerges in the ancient Middle East. And all of the alphabets we use today, the Roman alphabet, Cyrillic alphabet, all stem from that original Middle Eastern invention, which we call the Aleph Bey, the Aleph Bey. And the traditional Hebrew Aleph Bey, because the letters are Aleph, Bey, Gimel, Dalet, it's very interesting. In our tradition, there are no vowels written on the page or on the scroll of the Torah. It's just consonants. Very potent word within the Hebrew tradition is the word ruach, which means the wind and means spirit at the same time. Ruach, the rushing spirit, it's sometimes translated. And it's very sacred. It's there in the first sentence of the Hebrew Bible. The world was without form and void, and a wind of God moved over the waters. Ruach of God moved over the waters. Ruach, very sacred because the wind is taken to be the very presence of the divine within the body's world. The wind, the air, the breath. Now, harking back to, it's a long-winded answer. Forgive me. But harking back to something I had just been reading about here. In oral cultures, language is not a visible set of signs on the page. It's not a static thing. It's first and foremost, human language is speech. It's what I'm doing up here, it's speaking. And speech is nothing other than shaped breath, right? You've probably noticed that you only speak after you inhale some of this invisible stuff, and then you breathe it out. And as you breathe out, you shape it with your tongue and lips and palate, and it vibrates a couple folds in your throat, and you send it out into the world. And so the assumption in oral culture, in every oral culture I know, is that speech is shaped breath, that the breath is the implicit intermediary in all communication. That is the air, the wind, the breath is the holy of holies. It's this uttermost mystery because it's invisible. We can't see it, but it's that through which we see everything else. And we see that we can't think a single thought without continually imbibing this invisible stuff. So the air is this incredible mystery. In the early alphabets, only the consonants are written down. The vowels, which are the breath sounds, are not written. If you look at the most holy name of God in the Hebrew tradition, the four-letter name, YHWH, which we've heard pronounced as Yahweh. But this is illegitimate. We don't know how it's pronounced because there's no vowels written there. It's just YHWH, or Yud He Vav He, are the Hebrew consonants. So, why didn't we write down those vowels? Well, because the vowels are the breath. And the breath is the ruach. It's the very presence of the divine here in the body's world. It is invisible in principle. And you cannot make a visible representation of the invisible breath. And so we didn't do it. We didn't write down the vowels. We just wrote the consonants, the shapes we give to the vowels. Ba, k, d, w. But the vowels, a, e, a, o, u, are the sounds made by the unimpeded breath as it moves through the mouth. O, ah. Can't write that down. That would be sacrilege, in a sense. is making a visible representation of the unseen, of the invisible spirit. So we didn't do it. But if you look at those letters that make the most holy name of God in the Hebrew tradition, and you meditate on those like ecology, YHWH, it might suddenly strike you that these are the most breath-like consonants in any alphabet. Y, H, and W, and then the H. So it's Y, H, W, H. And if you meditate upon that for another few months, few years, it may suddenly strike you like a fist out of the blue that, of course, there's a secret to the pronunciation of this name, but it's nothing like we've heard, that this most holy name of God in the Western tradition, pronounced rightly, sounds something like this. It's the name we all speak whenever we're conscious of our breathing, which is this rocking in and out of ourselves that finds the depths inside us to the invisible depths around us and connects my lungs to those of a swallow swooping past and to the leaves of the aspens and the cottonwoods where I live. So the Hebrews and Jewish culture in general preserved its orality by not writing down the vowels. And this way, so it entered into a kind of literate relation to the visible world. And it said, God is not in this stone. God is not in that tree. God is not the cloud. But it kept a completely animistic relation to the invisible breath, to the winds, to the air, to the spirit, to the presence that surrounds us and moves through us and breathes through all things. Hebrew culture traditionally is both oral and literate at the same time. Our tradition says we have received the written Torah, but it's useless without the oral Torah that goes alongside it. And that's the teachings that are passed on face to face, person to person, in story form. It's one example of a coexistence of both literate and oral modes. The oral mode is always animistic, magical. It always carries the sense that everything is alive, that everything is at least filled with sentience. Yeah. So it's one example, and an instructive one, I think, because it said we can be deeply literate, we can be intellectual, we can be even digitally engaged, but we have to leave some time in our days for an interchange with one another and with the place where we live that is not mediated by the written word, either on the page or on the screen, but that happens face to face in flesh and blood, not Skyping with our friends, but actually gathering in a place like this and sharing a good meal together, telling stories, exchanging stories. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Do you think music is maybe a good link for us to incorporate this elemental force that we that ricochets off all of us, and music can bring the oral tradition actually into our incarnate being self as well?
Absolutely.
Just interested in what you think about that, because I know oral traditions are often presented in a rhythmic manner.
Absolutely. Yeah. Rhythm is of the essence. And I don't know if you've seen, in my tradition, the praying that happens in Jewish culture is it's always involves rocking back and forth. If you go in a synagogue and where folks are even praying, reading from the prayer book, they're going to be rocking back and forth as they speak the prayer. Rhythm is of the essence, I think, to any oral culture. But music, of course, music. But again, by oral culture, I don't just mean the face-to-face sharing of stories, but everything that goes with that. And of course it's music, and of course it's dance. But it's not music that's being pumped in through speakers from an MP3 player. It's the music we make sharing the same ruach, sharing the same breath with one another in a common place. And of course, when you're sharing the same spirit, the same air, any bird swooping past, any animal loping through can influence the story, can influence the music, and shift it. Because the oral world, or the world of the face-to-face, or the world where we share a common breath, it's not just, it's never strictly human. It's always local, but it's never exclusively human, because of course the air that we are taking in is what's being breathed out by all the plants. And what they breathe out is being taken up not just by humans, but by all the other walking and crawling folks and flapping peoples around. So there's no way to make it an exclusively human affair. But when one enters into the regime of the written word, it does begin to close human language in upon itself. Only when the alphabet comes into a traditionally oral culture does that culture get this odd idea that language is an exclusively human property. And everything else in the land begins to fall mute. So it doesn't speak. But that is a notion entirely alien to oral tradition. And I'm aware that I'm here in Scotland, standing in the midst of a land where oral culture resonates and rocks and lives and dwells and sings. And yes, the rocks themselves are participants in it. So, music, of course, but not music that's being pumped in or played off recording.
I just wanted to follow on from that because, first of all, can I just say that you were fantastic, a really fantastic speaker, really inspiring. But I think that all music comes from the experience of listening to what's around us, as I think that our language is related to the music that we create. I think that they were parallel once and then somehow got split. And I'm really interested in tracing this within our oral culture that's in Scotland and in Britain. And I was really interested when you were talking about mimesis, and I'm interested in the kind of traces of sound mimesis in Gaelic and Scots and English oral tradition.
Yeah.
Any songs, but
Yeah. No, it's so right on what you say. That in some way, language, when we begin to notice that human languages all originated in a deeply oral context, then we know that since every traditionally oral culture we can find carries something of this animistic style, then human language arose in a deeply animistic context. Every human language was born not just by humans speaking to one another, but it was born of humans who were listening intently and speaking to the whole more than human field of voices. And so, yes, language originates also as song, long and chant, long before it becomes something that we can think of as, neatly separable from them. But sound mimesis, when you're speaking a sound spell of words. I continually.
And
That,
instruments as well.
excuse me?
Not just vocal, but through instruments that humans have made as well.
Yes, for sure. But I'm especially fascinated with how human language can have so forgotten its rootedness in the whole soundscape, the speaking soundscape. And then here in Britain, though, you have, as we do some in the States, but some great poets who mine this oral, mimetic, spell-casting nature of words, word magic, really. Like, I guess you all know Gerard Manley Hopkins. Complete dazzling to me the way this guy is using the taste of words. Words, many of which I know not the meaning of them. But the feeling in the texture of his tongue. So he's a fairly recent discovery for me, but he's blown my mind. He's got this poem about a brook,